Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Gird Up podcast. My name is Charlie Ungemach. I'm very, very glad that you are here. Before we get started with today's interview, I'd like to invite you to help support the work that we do here at Gird Up by buying us a cup of coffee. We call it a cup of coffee donation because for the price of a cup of coffee, you can help support the ministry we're doing here at Gird Up as we flood the internet with confessional content and help prepare the people of God for whatever lies ahead. If you'd like to help support or fund the conversations we're having here at Gird Up, go to www.girdupministries.com, select buy us a cup of coffee in the main menu, and make your donation there. I'll make sure all that is down in the show notes below, as well as any other links that might be important by the time we get to the end of this episode, including links to the website and so forth. Thank you to those of you who are already supporting the work that we do. We appreciate it very much. Thank you for helping us put these things together. All this content is free to anybody around the world that wants to listen to it and enjoy it and grow from it. So thank you for making that possible. Our guest today is soon to be pastor, but still Mr. for now, Mr. Chris Gorr. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you're now, I think, the fourth, by the time this episode comes up, the fourth seminary senior who's going to talk about their thesis paper. You wrote your thesis paper about moral injury and kind of giving a background on what moral injury is, how it's different from things like PTSD, and then how ministers and other Christians can help serve those who are suffering from things like moral injury. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, why you chose this topic, why it was an important thing to you, and so forth.
Certainly. I'm a second career student. My previous career was in law enforcement, and that's where I experienced some moral injury myself. And I'm married with my wife, Jenny. We will be celebrating our 27th anniversary next month. We have 6 beautiful children, 3 boys and 3 girls. Our oldest, Madison, will be 24 this summer. Our second oldest, Haley, is 22. My oldest son, Tate, is 20. Her second oldest son, Zach, will turn 18 this summer. And our youngest daughter, Sarah, will turn 12 this summer. And our youngest, Keenan, turns 10 on Call Day. And so he'll celebrate his 10th birthday here and find out where at least his next 4 birthdays will be.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
It's a big day for the whole family.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Now, you've mentioned that you mentioned already that you experienced some moral injury yourself. And in your presentation, you mentioned you have some family who's also now serving in law enforcement and things as well. Why this topic? There's all kinds of things I'm sure you experienced. Even if you wanted to stay within your experience, there are other things you experienced that you could have written about, and you chose moral injury. Why moral injury?
Moral injury, in my opinion, is something that it's nothing new. It's certainly, there's examples of it in the Bible, but it's something that has received more attention in the last couple decades. And it's similar to trauma and PTSD, but it's different. And my goal through this thesis project was to draw more attention to it. And then also, I was thankful to leave law enforcement when I did in 2019 to pursue this career change. And I got out just before the riots in the Twin Cities and all of that. And I was thankful to leave when I did, but my 2 oldest daughters both married into law enforcement. And so this project was something that I told my thesis advisor I didn't care what I got for a grade on it. I just hoped that it might help my sons-in-law so that they don't suffer or experience any of the devastating effects that it can have, not just on the individual, but also on families.
Yeah. Is this something you personally have had to struggle with?
Well, yes, and I'm sure we'll get into it in the discussion. There's different ways that you can experience or be exposed to it, and mine will I'll explain when we get to that point how mine was experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, and as we go, I don't necessarily know all the right terminology and everything. So if I
Mhm.
say something wrong or whatever, feel free to correct me and we'll make sure we're using the right language for these things and so forth. Yeah.
And I'm by no means an expert on this topic. It's just something that was very near and dear to me and something that I had some experience with. And I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to write
Yeah,
on it.
absolutely. Why did you decide to become a police officer?
Initially, I was interested in becoming a conservation officer. I was raised and brought up very much outdoor oriented. Our family loved to hunt and fish and trap and camp and anything outdoor related. And so I had big aspirations to become a conservation officer and started my training going that direction. And then I got a 2-year degree in natural resource law enforcement. And then from there, I went on and got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And during that time, I learned that if you are an avid enjoyer of those things, that if you become a conservation officer or game warden, the reality is you're not going to be able to be out there doing any of that likely because that's when you'll be working and
I
you'll be
suppose.
enforcing the laws and so at least until you get some experience or seniority. So that, and I did test for some of those positions, but there's just a lot more opportunities in law enforcement outside of that. And one of those opportunities presented itself as I was finishing up my bachelor's degree. I needed to do an internship and did one with a sheriff's department. And then that led into a full-time position.
Yeah. Now you spent some time in Alaska, didn't you?
Yes. The majority of my career, I worked in Minnesota for a sheriff's department. I started as a deputy sheriff and then was a canine officer for a short time and then was promoted to an investigator or detective. I did that for the longest stretch, about 15 years. And then we moved to Alaska and I was a police officer up there before starting the career change.
Yeah. So I got all kinds of follow-ups to that. But first, why my understanding is that you're not necessarily forced to climb the ladder and become an investigator detective. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Why did you choose to pursue that?
It was better hours, honestly. It was, for the most part, days and weekends off. You were still subject to call out during the night or on weekends if there was a death or an emergency, but otherwise, better hours. And that meant a lot having a family.
And a fairly large family too. Yeah. What types of things are you investigating as a sheriff's? Because a sheriff's deputy is a little different than being like a metro police officer and so forth. What yeah, what kinds of things are you investigating as a sheriff's deputy, an investigator with the sheriff's department, I guess?
The department that I worked for was an outstate department in central Minnesota, and we weren't
What does outstate mean?
outside the metro.
Okay, got it.
And so in Minnesota, you have, I think it's like the 7 or 9 county metro area around the Twin Cities. And those are larger departments where they would have people specialize in certain areas. And so the department that I worked for, we would handle everything from death investigations to property crimes. And so you had to be a jack of all trades and be familiar with and able to handle anything that was assigned to you.
Yeah. So does that mean you have to have a I imagine it means you have to have a pretty clear understanding of the law also then, right? I imagine that's a lot of homework, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, yeah. And, it's something that uh, the longer you work, the more experience you get too.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah, and if you had to investigate something in one area, I suppose the next time you don't quite have to do as much research on it and so forth. Okay. What kinds of crimes and things come up for a sheriff's department in outstate Minnesota?
Everything that you probably would experience in a larger metropolitan area, just as far as violent crime, thankfully, it's not as frequent or common, but you still are not immune from it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So is this the kind of situation where you have pretty much always a caseload going, or is this a more okay? There's always something to investigate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, your desk is never clear.
Yeah. And then when you decide to make the move I imagine you had some seniority in Minnesota, right? That you're kind of climbing up. What was behind the decision to go to Alaska?
Well, a sheriff's department is political, and so every 4 years you have the possibility of having a new or different boss. And over the course of 21 years, I worked for, I think, 4 different sheriffs. And at the time that we left, our family, we had just gone on a family vacation to Yellowstone and the Tetons, I think a year before. And my wife and I, we just loved the mountains and the change of scenery. And at the time, our oldest was a freshman in high school. And we were really on the fence about what to do. We weren't sure. And ultimately, we thought that if we don't try, we're always going to look back at this point in our life and wonder what if. And so I applied and was hired, and it was amazing how things just fell into place after that. And yeah, we moved a family of 8, 3,500 miles across 3 time zones. And so
I know from
that was
here,
no small feat.
yeah, from here to Calgary is almost exactly 24 hours. What is it from the cities to Anchorage?
It was like, I think total drive time, if you were to drive straight through, it would have been like in the low 50s.
That's a hike.
And so, yeah, we didn't drive straight through as a family, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you do some hunting and fishing while you're up there?
Yeah, yeah, obviously.
Anything exciting?
Well, up there, we were in Kenai, which is on the Kenai Peninsula, 3.5 hours southwest of Anchorage. And so most people, when they hear that I was in Alaska, they think of Alaska as this frozen, frigid wasteland of the North Pole. And while it's true, Alaska can be bitterly cold in the interior, where we were, it was close to the ocean. And so the temperatures there were actually milder than they are here in the Midwest in winter because of the ocean. We would get more snow. They would measure snow. Here it's by the inch, there it would be by the foot. And so, but yeah, and while we were there, we were able to get more salmon than what we actually knew what to do with. And so we ate salmon weekly, and salmon is really healthy, and you look for all different ways of making it. And our kids actually got burnt out on salmon, and to this day, our girls don't really care for it. And so, but yeah, and I did hunting and trapping and fishing while we were there and in my spare time and enjoyed it.
What's your favorite hunt that you've ever?
I had the opportunity when I was there to shoot a Boone and Crockett brown bear that I've shot black bears in Minnesota before. And when you go out in the woods and in an area where there's brown bears, that just brings it to a whole new level because you know that you're not at the top of the food chain. And so, yeah, an experience all its own.
Yeah, I haven't dealt a little bit with brown bears. They're not. I mean, you don't want to walk up and mess with them, right? But they're not real. As long as you pretty much leave them alone, they're gonna kind of leave you alone. It's probably not the case with brown bears.
Well, I think, yeah, with uh, anything, that the most dangerous situation would probably be a sow with cubs. And it's interesting you bring that up. There's actually more people that are injured by moose in Alaska than there are by bears, and that's because there's so many more moose. And it's really dangerous if there's a cow moose with calves that you keep your distance because the cow will be very protective, and so that's how a lot of people get hurt or even killed.
Yeah. Did you go out on your own? Did you have a company that you worked with for the bear?
No, that was all on my own.
Did you go out with the intent of I'm getting a brown bear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
And that particular hunt was in the spring, and residents it depends on what part of the state you're in as far as what the regulations are, but that was a baited hunt in the spring. And so,
Did you go out by yourself or did you have somebody come with you?
no, I was by myself.
That's a lot of meat to carry back.
Well, and actually, we didn't eat the brown bear. They're not palatable
Okay.
or as palatable as a black bear, and especially one that age. And so I have a brown bear rug on my wall, but we don't have a wall big enough to display it. So
So is it hanging on a ceiling then too, or?
I actually made like a Paul Bunyan sawhorse that I have it draped over.
Okay. Very cool. Very
So
cool. So then when the girls bring boyfriends over for the first time,
yeah.
you're standing next to the shack. That actually brings up an interesting point. Did you encourage or discourage your daughters from marrying into law enforcement? I mean, don't say anything that'll get you in trouble with your son-in-laws, but
No, no, we didn't discourage it. And that's, an interesting thing too with my background in law enforcement, that as a father, you get a sense for being able to judge people, and you can, ask questions and find out, what someone is like. And obviously, I don't have the connections anymore that I did when I was working, but that was always the joke too, that I could look up, and find any dirt on anybody through my work, but not anymore.
unless you really needed to, I'm sure you could come up with something. So you eventually, after you moved to Alaska, you mentioned eventually that path then led to you coming back to school, going down to Martin Luther College, and beginning the work to prepare to be a pastor. What brought that decision?
Law enforcement is largely a young man's occupation. A lot of my coworkers would look for something they could transition into later in life. Law enforcement really opened my eyes to how fragile life is. Tomorrow isn't promised to anyone, and you would see that on a regular basis, whether it was through car crashes or other, accidents or whatever. And then also it was a very stark, vivid reminder that we are in a broken, sinful world. And you see just how unchurched and dechurched so much of our society is. And I would say even more so if you get outside of our Wells bubble, and go, in other states where Christianity is very much a minority.
Yeah. Why you? Why why was it something that was particularly like you mentioned the idea that you want to that you witnessed a lot of people that don't hear and see the gospel, don't know the gospel. What did you see in yourself that said, I think this is something I can do or I want to do?
Well, I guess just like being a cop, if someone were to have asked me that when I was younger or in high school, I would have never in a million years guessed that. But God works in amazing ways. And so I had, as a father, I had been active in congregations that we were members at. And one in particular, I helped with the youth program. The youth group leader had left and no one else was stepping up to take that position. I had my two oldest girls were that age, and I didn't want the program to fall by the wayside. I understood the importance of it and really didn't have any training or knowledge as far as what was involved. So very much so, it was a volunteer lay-led position, but I learned on the go and did that for a few years and was encouraged by pastors along the way, hey, have you ever considered ministry? I think you might, be good. And I would always brush it off and say, no, that's not for me. And then later in my career in law enforcement, then I gave it some more thought.
Yeah. Have you seen any crossover between, obviously you're not a pastor yet, not called as a pastor yet, but you've vicared and you've been through quite a bit of training now preparing to be a pastor. Have you seen any crossover in skills or applications between your work as a law enforcement officer and now the work you're training for as a pastor?
I'm not sure, as far as crossover, it certainly has given me a lot of experience and exposure, work experience. I'm able to share, whether it's through sermons or teaching, my personal experiences and my work experience, and then also certainly as a father and husband.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even your ability to choose a topic like this to write your paper on as well. So you mentioned that moral injury and PTSD are not the same thing, although they are related. What would you say the difference is? If you're comfortable doing so, maybe briefly, just your understanding of. Let's set the baseline. What's your understanding of PTSD, and then how is that different than what you're talking about when you talk about moral injury?
hmm Uh, PTSD and trauma would be the injuries that someone receives, and I guess the moral injury would be the spiritual side of that, the spiritual component. And so that's where, when someone experiences moral injury, which would be something that they've done or failed to do or witnessed that transgresses or violates their deeply held moral beliefs or disrupts their moral compass, so to speak. And secular counselors are certainly offering help to people that might be suffering from this. But this is where chaplains and pastors are especially well suited to bring the gospel and the healing balm of the gospel to these wounded souls.
So, just making sure I'm understanding you correctly, the PTSD is more of the emotional side, maybe mental and emotional side, and the moral injury is more the spiritual side.
That's fair.
Okay. So, how is the experience different? Maybe like what might cause one or the other? I guess, does that make sense? I'm curious. Somebody might be struggling with PTSD, but not a moral injury, and it's probably, in my mind, this seems less likely, but certainly possible that somebody could be struggling with a moral injury, but not necessarily PTSD. Like I said, that one seems a little less likely to me. Maybe you have insight on that. But I guess if you're looking at somebody from the outside, how can you tell the difference?
Good question. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on this. And so I know that there, would certainly be feelings of shame and guilt. And as far as being able to distinguish between the two, uh, just, on the surface, I'm not sure what that might look like. But again, knowing that moral injury is the spiritual component places pastors and chaplains in a special place to address this.
Yeah, and I think that highlights the reality that everybody's brain is a little different. Everybody's put together a little bit differently. So there's different things that bother us. There's different ways that um, our minds and hearts are injured, right? And everybody's a little bit different. So you don't necessarily know what's going to have such an impact. You don't necessarily know how it's going to present later on. And you don't necessarily know what's going on under the hood either. Because, I mean, a lot of times we don't even recognize what's going on in ourselves, much less in other people. So, I mean, to some degree, I wouldn't say these things are subjective, but they certainly are not as black and white as other things, right? If you've got appendicitis, I mean, it's a swollen appendix, right? If you've got strep throat, there's a strep bacteria growing in your throat. It's not that simple oftentimes with these types of injuries. Why call it an injury?
Good question. I guess because, and this is just my immediate thought or answer, that it's something that can be repaired or you can heal from. And so at the same time, I don't know if you could call it a scar, um, that after healing or repair has occurred, it's still something that is there that could remind you of that, but certainly it is repairable or something that you can heal from.
Yeah. Yeah, and to that, you mentioned secular counseling. Secular counseling is a good thing, especially when it's well done. But you hint at the idea that secular counseling might not be what everyone needs, especially when, or maybe not the only thing they need, especially when there is a moral injury involved. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's good that you brought up maybe not all that they need, because pastors or chaplains, when they are counseling someone that might be suffering from this, like we discussed, it's possible that they could be suffering from both. And so a secular counselor might be better suited to address the trauma part of it, where a pastor or chaplain could address the spiritual side of it.
Yeah. And the degree to which pastors and counselors can work together, it varies, but recognizing that there's more than one component here is also an important thing. This is an off the wall question. I don't know if you know the answer to this or not. Is it your impression, at least, that counselors are generally willing to work with a pastor?
I'm not sure. I don't have any experience
Yeah.
in that area yet. Your vicar year, you're not allowed to do any counseling. And so I I wouldn't really know how easily or how commonly that works.
Yeah. Just this is completely anecdotally, but yeah, it seems to me that there's a pretty strong line drawn between the two. But a person who also begins to understand what they're going through, I think, can also walk that line pretty well. I would say, and even outside the realm of moral injury, I mean, there's a growing number of people in our world who are working with both a counselor and a pastor, and those two things are not mutually exclusive, and they don't necessarily have to be having briefings to make sure they're on the same page and so forth. The pastor is a spiritual guide, and your mental health counselor is a mental health counselor, and the two things certainly are related, but they're not the same thing. So I'd be interested to find out what that relationship is like. I think probably most of the time the answer is they're just two different things, right? Like your mechanic and your carpenter don't necessarily talk to each other about what's going on at your house, right? Yeah. What makes it particularly difficult for, well, let's back this off even. Why police, military, and first responders, frontline workers, why is this seeming to be something that they would, because it's not something exclusive to them.
No.
Why does this seem to be something they deal with at a higher rate?
Good question. And that's something that I address in my paper. They are at a significantly higher rate than the general public to experience this. And so it's not a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when. For example, I believe one of the quotes that I ran across that the FBI had released just in the last few years was that a police officer during the course of a 20-year career is exposed to uh, I believe it was like 175 critical incidents, and a critical incident could be defined as where someone loses their life or nearly someone is killed or nearly killed. And by contrast, the general public on average might experience one or two of those in a lifetime. And so it's just at a much, much higher rate. And then um, I wrote my paper with my experience and background in law enforcement, and much of the literature that's been devoted to this in recent years has been from the military perspective, and the VA has done a lot of research and work on this. And so it seems like that's where a lot of the funding has been. And so that's where a lot of the recent findings and research and articles are in that area. And military and law enforcement or public safety, they overlap in a lot of ways, and their training is similar, and they're both trained to protect life and to take life if necessary. And so this was, I guess, why I approached it from that angle.
Yeah. In your experience as a police officer, did you ever, was it ever something that I'm not asking for specifics, obviously. Did you ever end up in a situation, um, that bothered you this way, that kind of caused a moral injury?
I'm thankful that during my career, a career that spanned 24 years, I tell everyone with the overtime it was probably 25. And so, but I'm thankful that I never had to shoot anyone. I drew my gun and, pointed my gun at dozens of people. I worked alongside officers that had to shoot people. I worked alongside officers that were shot and lived. I worked alongside officers that were hit by motorists on traffic stops and lived. And God blessed me with never having to actually squeeze the trigger. But the atrocities and a lot of just the horrors that I saw and witnessed and was exposed to, that's very, very toxic and it's cumulative. And the side of moral injury that I experienced, there's different ways that you can experience it. You can either experience it through an act of commission, something that you do, or an act of omission, something that you fail to do, or it can be from exposure and being exposed to things that you don't have any control over. And that last option was my type of exposure.
Yeah. When you talk about things that are toxic to experience, again, I'm not asking you for specifics, of course, but as far as like specific incidents, but what kinds of things are law enforcement in particular, because that's your background, dealing with that you would say are the toxic things that kind of build up in your system, if you will?
Sure. What would probably be at the top of the list when I worked investigations, I was part of a larger task force that was called Internet Crimes Against Children. And that was something where I was fortunate to receive some advanced specialized training in computers and forensics. But the drawback was that any child porn investigations or related crimes, then you were expected to take the lead on that. And so I'm thankful that the agency that I worked for didn't get a lot of those cases. We would get some every year. But by contrast, larger metro departments would have people assigned strictly to that unit. And that's what they would do day in and day out, week in and week out. And they would just be working those cases and they would experience significant burnout. And so, so when you're exposed to that material and you're having to view those images or videos, it's certainly very toxic.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then, I mean, it's not just the day of the investigation either. You're building a case. You're working with the attorneys. What are they called? Law enforcement part of the justice system.
The prosecutor.
Thank you. You're working with prosecutors to build a case and so forth. And then you're testifying. Like these things it's not just one exposure either. Yeah. I think with other frontline workers, I mean, military to some degree is self-explanatory. I think not necessarily, but to some degree. Same thing with if you're working in the back of an ambulance, there's a certain number of things you just see, right? And like I said, those things build up in your system.
And that's why I included under the umbrella of public safety or first responders, police, fire, EMS, and then also dispatchers.
Dispatchers, yeah. Want to say more about dispatchers?
When you might not expect them to be subject to it, but they are actually the first people who often receive the call for help, and they're going to be the ones that answer the phone, the 911 call, and they're going to be the ones that send help over the radio there. And they might not know how something plays out or what's happening. And so there can be some really tense uncertainty depending on, the situation and how things go. And so that is a very high stress position. I would always tell our dispatchers I never wanted their job. I would always gladly be out in the squad and have to handle one thing at a time where a dispatcher might be juggling multiple emergencies and they're handling multiple things at once.
Yeah. Before this conversation, I guess in my mind, I was imagining dispatchers essentially answering the phone and making sure that the person on the other side that it gets forwarded to the right people. But a dispatcher does more than that.
Depending on the size of the agency, they might have, some that might only be assigned to phone traffic and then others to radio traffic. The agencies that I worked for were small and mid-sized agencies, and so their dispatchers would have had to have handled all of it.
Yeah. So, this is more just curiosity at this point. But like a dispatcher, how does a dispatcher communicate to, let's say, law enforcement or fire what is needed? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
So obviously, depending on what the call is, and then then they would share what the call is, and then if there's a request for more resources or different resources, then they would be the go-between for that.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Yeah. So kind of making sure everybody's aware of what's going on and what needs
hmm
to happen. Okay.
hmm
Interesting. Now, I like the way you describe people struggling with moral injury as spiritually wounded. I think that was a good way to think about it and describe it to the layman. How can Christian communities better serve people struggling with moral injury who have been spiritually wounded?
well, I think pastors and chaplains, and this kind of gets at the proactive side of things that I wrote about in my paper. It was really an eye opener for me with the research that I did. I did interviews of chaplains and pastors across the country, from small congregations up to large congregations. And I was surprised that not everyone knew what moral injury was. And from those who did, most of what their experience has been reactive. And so I wanted to stress the importance through this paper of drawing more attention to the topic, and then also for pastors and chaplains to realize that this group, military and first responders, are at a higher risk of experiencing it. And so that they can work to build relationships with those members, recognizing that it's, like we said earlier, not a matter of if, but when, so that when they do have that, like from a law enforcement standpoint, when they do have that difficult shift or that nightmare of a call, that they already have that relationship with their pastor or a chaplain, that they would feel comfortable talking to them. Because I think, that's probably the biggest hurdle to get over, is just to establish that relationship. And I think based on a lot of my reading and research for this, that's something that would be shared by the military as well.
How do you go about building that kind of rapport? Because you can't, especially as a cold worker, you're not going to become you can try to be all things to all people, but you're not going to go out and become a police officer in order to better serve police officers while also serving as a pastor, and same with EMS and nurses and so forth. So how do you build that kind of rapport so that those relationships do exist?
I guess from a pastor's standpoint, it might be an option to offer or to check in with your local agencies to see if there is a chaplaincy program or not. And that might be something that you could participate in. And then certainly also from a law enforcement standpoint, you could look into doing ride-alongs with officers from different departments in the area. And that would be something where civilians would ride with law enforcement. And it's kind of like a sneak peek at what goes on, in the life of a cop. And it would be kind of like, some of the reality TV shows. And so those would be ways that you could certainly look at the law enforcement or public safety side of things, and then certainly um to visit, the police departments, sheriff's departments, fire departments, ambulance services, and that. But then from a military standpoint, what I had found from the chaplains that I talked to and the pastors that are working near military bases is that often the bases would have like a community day each year where it's open to the community to come onto the base. And so there's different programs apparently that are available or in effect where a pastor might be able to meet some of the servicemen or women and get some exposure that way, and that way they would be able to maybe connect a name with a face.
Yeah. And I imagine like there's to some degree there's ministry of presence there too, right? You're the guy who's around.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to make those connections if you're the guy who's around. Yeah. Um, when you say visit, do you mean just pop in and say hi? Do you mean so you said law enforcement agencies and things like that. You also mentioned a ride along and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It sounded like you meant like that you were suggesting that pastors should regularly visit the law enforcement agency. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there might be community events that are the law enforcement departments or agencies participate in, like National Night Out or different community events. Otherwise, I guess my suggestion would be to just reach out to the supervisor, whether it's the sheriff or the chief, and if you are interested, if they have a chaplaincy program or not, to go through, the supervisors and indicate your desire, your interest to participate if they have something like that or not. And if they don't, then certainly share your interest in your service.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You've mentioned a couple different times that, and I think I've maybe even asked this already, but just to dig a little deeper into it, what is it? Why is this something that we should be as pastors and staff ministers and co-workers? Why is this something we should be dealing with ourselves and not handing off to somebody else? Do you think?
Again, I think it probably comes back to that this is the spiritual side or component that we have the healing balm of the gospel that we can bring to those souls that are injured and so desperately need it. And so it's something that pastors and chaplains are especially suited to address, and much more so with moral injury than a secular counselor.
Yeah. Yeah. Why would I let somebody else shepherd my own sheep, right? What is it about the Word of God? What is it about the gospel that makes it effective dealing with these types of issues?
A lot of the Psalms and Lamentations talk about healing and restoration and how that is something that only God can do. And when someone is impacted by this injury and they are going through that valley of the shadow of death, that a pastor or chaplain is specially suited to um, give them the gospel and and then remind them that there is healing, there is hope, there is restoration. That today.
What is the hope that a frontline worker has after moral injury?
Well, so to not have it drive you to despair and to heal from it, to move beyond it, and to grow. It certainly impacts and changes who you are. What you've experienced and what you've been exposed to, you can never erase, but you can learn from it and be healed, and then to share that with others too, so that they might experience that same restoration is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. There is nothing that happens outside our God's purview. And no matter what that might be, he is still in control even when this happens.
Mhm.
Even now, he remains in control. And so recognizing that the gift of salvation that I've been given isn't just a get out of jail free card at the end of my life, but it offers something real and tangible and important every day of my life also, that I can live in the shadow of the resurrection. The glory, I don't know if a shadow isn't the right word, in the glorious light of the resurrection, right? That just overflows from the faith that I have, recognizing that my Savior died for this too.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. How have you changed, do you think? I didn't prepare you for this question. How have you changed, do you think, since you began working as a police officer?
Well, what I was exposed to, certainly, was cumulative, and it's something that I'm thankful that I've got a supportive wife. She also has a background in law enforcement. That's how we met, actually, and so that helps. She's very understanding of the demands of the job, but law enforcement, and for that matter, public safety and military, because of the stress and what they're exposed to, those occupations are also at a higher rate of experiencing divorce, alcoholism, and suicide, and it's one can only help but think that it's directly related to what they all are exposed to and have to go through.
Just constantly exposed to everybody else's sinful nature, right? Yeah. Yeah. Um, did you receive much or any preemptive spiritual care as a member of a church who was also working in law enforcement?
No. No, and so that's why I am emphasizing in my paper the importance of that. Also, when I started my career in law enforcement, a lot of the departments and agencies really didn't have a lot of resources or a lot available for people that experienced or went on difficult calls or were exposed to critical incidents. And so you were kind of expected to take it on the chin and suck it up, buttercup, or perhaps you weren't cut out for this line of work. And it was partway into my career that critical incident stress debriefings became available. And to this day, a lot of employers are now realizing the importance of their employees' mental health and how this is an area that's been neglected in the past. And so there's more attention and more resources being devoted to this just so that employers can see better longevity out of their employees. But still, that depends on the size of the agency. Larger agencies certainly have more resources available than smaller agencies.
But I imagine they have more challenges too. Those two things often go hand in hand.
Yeah,
Or it's just higher number of total. I don't know how to say it now. The a higher volume of people facing these issues, not percentage wise necessarily, but a higher volume, which maybe can justify a higher level of care. But that, I think, makes just the opposite point, is um, those who aren't necessarily working, like, one, higher volume doesn't necessarily equal better care, and two, lower volume um, could mean that those who need help might fly under the radar. If there's not somebody specifically looking out for these things, that they could fly under the radar. As a minister of the gospel, what, and this is conjecture obviously, what are you looking out for as maybe warning signs that somebody might need some extra spiritual care?
I would probably look for like isolation or withdrawal. That's some of the telltale signs that there might be more going on, and that's something too that a pastor isn't going to be in a position to pick up on as well as a spouse or a family member. And so That's where having um, these intentional relationships on the part of a pastor or chaplain would put you in a position where you're better able to address it when it comes up. Uh, Say, for example, if a spouse comes to you with some concerns about, if they feel that their, husband or wife may have experienced or went through something that they seem distant or aren't opening up, and in all fairness, there's some things that they may not be able to share, that it might be something pending. And but at least from a law enforcement standpoint, there's a privilege that is a special privilege that's given to clergy, where you, as an officer, would be able to disclose or open up to uh, clergy something that you might not be able to share with others.
How do you, which just doubles down again on the importance of having rapport, not just with the individual, but with the whole family, right?
Mhm.
We're providing pastoral care to families, and all the individuals in those families. How do you wish you had been prepared for what you were going to? You said you really received no spiritual, like proactive spiritual care, especially with regard to moral injury. How do you wish you had been prepared? If you could go back and put something in place for yourself, how do you wish you would have been prepared?
I guess you don't. I didn't know um, how being exposed to all what I was exposed to, or having to, you know, handle what I did, how that impacts you. And so I guess for a pastor to be intentional and to know the occupations of the members of their congregation, so that if you do have members that are first responder, public safety, or military, that way you can at least reach out to them, that if you ever want or need to talk to someone about anything you experienced at work, my door is always open, and that it will be confidential, and that it's a safe place to talk. That I think by laying that groundwork ahead of time, you are going to be set up to effectively bring the gospel to them when they need it most. And so, but yeah, because moral injury, like we talked about earlier, is a relatively new dynamic or component uh, to trauma and PTSD. It's receiving more attention just in the last 10, 15 years. And so now, thankfully, people that are in public safety or military now are hopefully receiving more help than ever before.
Yeah. This is not a new issue either. You mentioned in your paper that there's plenty of examples from scripture
Mhm.
of people who've experienced moral injury. Are there any of those stories that were particularly poignant to you, or that spoke to you in a meaningful way?
There's examples in both the Old and New Testament. One that really surprised me was I had gone to a presentation that Pastor Henselin had put out a few years back on moral injury, and I really didn't know much about it. Before that, it was something that really opened my eyes to moral injury. In this part of the examples from the Bible, one that kind of surprised me was King David. He talked about as an example of opposite walls, and how with what David did with Bathsheba and Uriah, that may have been the result of moral injury that David experienced. That you look at David's life and as a king, and certainly his abuse of his authority and power as a king, the sin that led to. Pastor Henselin had mentioned how this opposite walls theory is, you take someone that you would never expect to do anything like that, and how, because of the moral injury that they suffer or experience, that person is now taking risks that they would have never before taken, and how that may have been what happened in the case of David.
David's an excellent example, right,
Yeah.
of behavior that just seems out of character for this guy.
Exactly.
Why would he be doing such a thing? And this is potentially something that played a role in the incident.
Not to excuse what he did,
Right.
but it might help explain why someone like David fell.
Man after God, a man who God himself called a man after his own heart. And that also, to some degree, I think help explain some of the just depths of woe that you find David in the Psalms also. You brought up the Psalms a couple different times and their beauty and their usefulness. He's got a depth of sorrow. He's certainly got a height of joy that many of us don't quite attain to, but he's got a depth of sorrow also that, by the grace of God, I'm not sure I've ever been quite that low. And you think about how David spent his teen years and his 20s. Talk about toxic things adding up one after the next. Everything from physical and verbal abuse to abandonment and manipulation, and then battle on top, the countless battles on top of that. It would be almost absurd not to assume that he would not have some sort of repercussions from that in his mental and spiritual life. So it's an interesting thing. Good. Now, one of the last things I was hoping to talk about is you brought up one of your authors, or one of the authors that you cited in your paper, talked about the idea of a combat patch of the cross. And I like that idea. You want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, that was something that I found that Paul Zemer had wrote. I had actually looked at a couple of different things that he had put out, and the combat patch that he was talking about is how we wear a patch on our hearts, and that is the cross of Jesus. And that's something that, again, makes pastors and chaplains and all believers uniquely suited to bring that hope that we have in Christ to all who are hurting and suffering, and to share that.
Yeah. What do you miss about your life as a law enforcement officer? Is there anything you wish you could just strap on one more time, or go give it a go one more time?
You know, I really enjoyed helping people, and that was probably one of the most rewarding things, was to be able to help people. But it was something where that career was changing, and I saw it during my career that there was a growing lack of respect for authority, much more so in larger urban metropolitan areas than outstate or smaller departments or agencies. But we would even see it, and that's something that I think, is not unique to public safety or law enforcement. I've even heard that from school teachers. And with your background in teaching, you may have seen that as well, where there's a growing lack of respect for authority. And so parents might, be more apt to side with their child than with the teacher if there's an issue at school. And so
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I found now that you say that, I'm thinking about it. I almost never played the teacher card. I found myself having to play the person card instead. Like, you know me, you trust me with your child every day. This is a relationship that we've built and I'm leaning on. And for many of the students, it was like, this is the second or third child from this family that I've now had. You know how I operate. You know who I am. And now that you say that, I very rarely, if ever, would appeal to my position as a teacher, which should be a given. Like, it should be this is what, that position should have some inherent respect to it. It's interesting that you say that. I hadn't thought about that before.
And I don't know if, there's differences between public and parochial schools and teachers, but
Well, if we're seeing it in our parochial schools, I would venture to say you're seeing it more pronounced in your public schools. It's probably a fair thing to say. Well, you brought a lot to think about. Appreciate you diving into some difficult stuff with us. Thank you for writing the paper, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing on the show. We have a fair number of guys who are in the military or have been out of the military that listen to the podcast. So thank you for the work you've done on their behalf. You mentioned you're going to do some presenting and things like that on these topics as well in different places around the synod. So thank you for doing that. God bless you for your work. God bless your new call coming up here soon. We're almost at the point where we should still say God willing, but we're almost at the point where we know that God's willed it. If you haven't been told, you're not getting a call yet. So the very eagerly looking forward to finding out where you go and serve permanently. And thank you for also the level of self-sacrifice it takes to come back and be a second career minister. It's a long path and not an easy one always, often not an easy one. So thank you for doing that as well. Yeah. Thank you for being on the show. God's blessings to all of you listening as well. If you're willing to help support the work that we do here at Gird Up, all those links are down in the show notes below. Until next time, God bless you, and we'll talk to you next week.